So good morning, everybody, and Alan, thanks for the invitation because it's really great to get an opportunity to talk about the importance of standards, particularly for SMEs, and especially for SMEs in the construction sector. And if I was given having this conversation with you a couple of years ago, I would have focused very much on structural standards. The world has changed, as you'll see, as I go forward through the presentation. But I suppose, firstly, to look at the use of standards, and Alan, you mentioned interoperability, and absolutely that is critical and key, because if you think about it, standards specify requirements, guidelines, and characteristics to be used from one deployment to another, and that's right across the board in all types of industries and all types of sectors. And the experience has been that where standards are utilised and where the output of the use of standardisation has been tracked, there's significant increase in performance. It has supported innovation, and indeed more recently is starting to support sustainability. And the reason for that is there's one good way of doing something. It's based on doing the same thing repeatedly because of the codification of requirements. It also then ensures that when I do something, I can talk to a different manufacturer, a different deployment, because the underlying language that we're using is all the same. So it is really, really important in that respect, particularly as the pace of technological development advances and accelerates. And Alan, you mentioned standards in a national context and an international context. I'm not going to go through the little diagram here on the slide, other than to say this is how standards are formulated and made. So the NSAI is a government agency, and it's our responsibility to take the voice of industry, whatever that industry might be, to bring those industry experts together to formulate the next best practice, the next standard. That then goes through a consultation process with the broadest industry representation, because obviously not everybody can sit on a standards committee, and ultimately it becomes a standard. So that's the typical standards path. Many of you will be familiar with it from a national perspective, and indeed most of the work of our national activity in the NSAI is in the area of construction. But that process also applies at European and international level. And standards and the NSAI provide an access route into both the European and the international, because by channeling activity international, we're also then bringing that voice forward to the European, and as you'll see as we go forward, even into the international perspective. So it's the industry pathway, as it were, into the various aspects of European and international standardisation. And while for an individual SME it might seem that it's impossible either to influence a standard or indeed to hear best practice of what's happening internationally, participation in this structure gives that access, and it is as such very, very important. So if I talk then and look at standards supporting the construction sector, and as I say, traditionally, the standards that would support the construction sector, and I'm sure you're all familiar with quite a number of these, would have traditionally focused on structural code, structural products. More recently, we have been involved in retrofitting and specifying standards in that space. We're also looking at timber frame construction, building on revising standards. So sometimes the standards are new standards, other times it's revisions based on industry learning and expertise. So within that as well, we are also looking at emergency lighting, modern methods of construction. That work has recently started, and indeed we also follow work that happens in other standards bodies. So say, for instance, in the UK at the moment, they've started to look at the initial language and dictionaries to underpin modern methods of construction. That's an evolving journey, and it's one that we're following, and indeed we have our own national committee that's feeding into that space. Other areas of activity in the traditional construction standards area, of course, relate to universal design and how we can use universal design in partnership with modern methods of construction, digitisation, to really build buildings of the future. So that's very much where we're at present from a traditional perspective. And of course, from an NSAI perspective, leaving aside standards, the next part of that is the evidence of standards being utilised and developed. And we have a significant programme of certification in this space as well, both in terms of BIM, C product approvals, agri-mod approvals, so quite a wide range. And I want to touch just for a minute on, I suppose, the committee that's of most relevance to you here, and that's the National BIM Committee. And I've included the actual technical references in terms of numbers, but I suppose really the point I want to get across here is this is an expert committee. There's 21 members. Members of that committee are drawn from industry, they're drawn from academia, and indeed also drawn from some of the key government agencies, so government procurement, HSE, and others. The committee meets about 4 times a year, and so one of the main jobs of that committee is watching what's happening in Europe, monitoring ballots and votes at Europe, looking at what's happening there, and indeed sometimes providing Irish input from an Irish perspective into that committee. That committee also at the moment is having discussions around about the forthcoming government bin mandate and how that might impact upon standards, and obviously are also charged with looking at the annex to ISO 19650. And in that context, the BIM committee, those 21 individuals, also have a channel into the International ISO committee, so they're monitoring that as well. So that's back to a national committee looking at European work and also looking at international work and having that access backwards and forwards. And I suppose if you look at that then, so we've gone from traditional construction to BIM, and I suppose the next area that I want to draw your attention to is the whole area of ICT and then the broader standards, because such is the pace of development within ICT generally. And previously what we would see, that standards would have been developed vertically. So there would be medical standards, construction standards, health and safety standards, and so forth and so forth. But what has been happening in the last 3 to 5 years is actually that the standards that are being developed are all horizontal. So this would have started off, probably the most rapid example of it would have been in something like blockchain, which started in fintech but moved very, very quickly to all sorts of areas that we would never have imagined. So because of that, I want to flag to you again the importance of ICT manufacturing and machinery standardization to the construction sector. I think it's really, really important again that you have an awareness of these areas. Obviously the data interoperability is one that follows quite closely from BIM and all the various issues with implementing BIM systems. But more and more other areas that need to be thought about include cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, 3D printing, even robotics and autonomous vehicles. All in their own way are going to impact upon how the future of the industry evolves. I suppose the advantage of standards is that it gives you an opportunity to learn from best practice in other fora. You learn from best practice from other experts, either at European or indeed international level. And I suppose that's one of the great leverages for SMEs, that they don't have to reinvent the wheel. Much of this is there and can be taken almost as read. So there's another driver as well that I want to flag in terms of the whole broadening of the digital mandate on the industry, and that's the whole regulatory infrastructure. So again, previously we would have thought about construction and construction regulations and the construction products regulation perhaps, and all that was in that space. But if you think about it and look at cybersecurity, artificial intelligence, and how those are layering in on BIM systems and the like of that, equally of relevance to the construction sector will be the EU Cyber Resilience Act, the EU AI Act, the Machinery Regulation, even the EU Data Act, because all of these are going to govern how data is used into the future. And obviously, again, the open data exchanges, those are the obvious ways where requirements from regulation will filter through into standardisation. But equally, there'll be new data dictionaries, there'll be new rules around the exchange of data to make sure that there's quality within the data and within the exchange all around construction products. So it's a big area, and the NSAI is heavily invested across all of these areas. And I suppose the one benefit of NSAI as a state agency is that we can take this learning and apply it to the construction area and vice versa. One other area to bring to your attention, again, that's gaining traction, again of importance, is the whole standards response around about climate action, the circular economy, and indeed sustainability. And this alone could merit a presentation in its own right. But what I've done here is just taken two examples where standards work is having an impact. The first of those is international. So it's an ISO technical specification which is specifying requirements and guidance on adaptation of planning for local government and communities, such that you see that. So that's at international level. There are standards that are ultimately going to feed down under the banner of climate action and sustainability and impact upon the work that you're doing. More locally, NSAI have contributed to a meta-Éireann research project to develop specific climate maps and data for use in building design. So that in time will lead to more national-based standards. So you can see that both nationally and internationally there's activity. And there's busyness, and the standards and the NSAI will funnel that for SMEs such that you can pick the pieces of it that are relevant to you. I'm mindful of time, so I just have one final slide, and it's to say, if I go back to the original slide, that original red box with the circular diagram, the most important thing for SMEs to remember is that standards can be influenced by SMEs, they can benefit from SMEs, and they can get involved in the whole standards process. Now that might be just as simple as actively using standards, drawing out standards, to participating in actual standards committees, or indeed to commenting when we go to public consultation. So I suppose the most important piece of this is an awareness that outside of the construction's general standards, general ICT, manufacturing standards, BIM standards, all will increasingly impact upon the sector. And it's important for people to get involved and, as I say at the top, have their say in the rollout of standards. So,
can I just one question?
You can indeed, yes.
Just throw out there just one, and that's just about standards and the fact that they're quite static. You know, but maybe what's needed in the future is more dynamic, machine readable standards. That smart technology needs smart standards. Is there any move along that side?
Absolutely.
Our second speaker, Eddie Sean here.
Yeah.
Is there a move along those lines?
There's absolutely a move along those lines, and a recognition that the standards as we know them, in paper form, in PDF form, that timeline and that format is limited.
Okay.
So there are programs of work at both European level, but I suppose if you bear in mind that all standards come from that international ISO and IEC source. Big amount of work happening there collaboratively between both of those organisations in looking at machine readable standards and indeed looking at further down the line what you can do from let's take the AI piece and apply that to standards, and how actually standards might well be, or components of standards might well be embedded in software into the future. So it's a huge area of growth, and very much a development area, still probably not as advanced, frankly, as it should be at this point.
Thanks, Geraldine.
Yeah. Okay.
Okay, sorry to put you there, Sean. So, you want to? Yeah.